It's good to see everybody. Hope you're having a good morning, and hopefully you're a little bit more together than I am. It's bad when the preacher ends up without a Bible, but here we are. So tell me how that happens. But I know how it happens. It's in my wife's car, and her and Harper are not here yet. So anyway, well. Looks like we've lucked out, though, because I grabbed a pew Bible, and this one hadn't had, I was worried that the passage I had needed would be ripped out, because sometimes it is, but it's not, so that's good. I shouldn't say ripped out. That makes it sound like somebody's ripping it out. Hadn't fallen out. We're a little bit behind. I will say we do have, you'll see this in the announcements, but we do have printed some labels for our Christmas card mailbox, and they are intended to have those paper clipped and all separated out, but Huntington Walmart has decided to not sell address labels anymore for some reason, so I had to go to Paris yesterday and didn't get back over here to get them printed, so I ran off 10 sets of those. There's 4 pages, and the last page is not full, so if you go and grab some, just get you 4 pages, make sure your last one is not full of names, and that's all you need. We only have 10 sets printed right now, but we'll print plenty just for the sake of time. In order to get the bulletin ran, I could only had time to do 10 this morning, so just wanted to mention that. All right, so we are in the book of 2 Samuel. Rob, do you know what's going on here? It's acting like it doesn't have input. So before we took our break for our evangelism series, and since we have gone back to our split classes, we're going to move that evangelism series to Sunday or Wednesday nights. So we're just going to come back to what we had started the last time that we had kind of our split classes, and that was we were looking at the life of David. Specifically, we had had studied up through the end of the book of 1 Samuel. Now, 1st and 2nd Samuel is much like a lot of our 1st and 2nd books, I guess all of our 1st and 2nd books in the Old Testament, in that they are broken up Samuel. We really are not, if we're thinking kind of originally, it's not like somebody wrote 1 Samuel and waited a while and came and wrote 2 Samuel. It's just a really good dividing line because you have essentially David's life, the immediate up through the persecution by King Saul in 1 Samuel, and then 2 Samuel is focusing more on David during his reign as king. He's been anointed as king for a long time, years at this point, but he is not serving as king, although if you remember toward the end of that persecution by Saul, as Saul's pursuing David, and David is out in the wilderness, and actually our sermon text for this morning is a text that is from that time when David is out in the wilderness and he is facing such opposition, but even then people were coming to the wilderness to flock to him, not just people who were also in trouble, but people who needed help. So David is already being recognized as a leader. So just hitting a few high points for 1st and 2nd, or 1 Samuel. Of course, it starts off with Eli, of course, introduced early in that story as well. Samuel is raised up. He is raised up to serve the Lord, but he is much better than Hophni and Phinehas. They are killed. Eli dies when he hears the word of the great defeat that they have experienced at the hand of the Philistines, falls off his stool. And Samuel then will grow to judge. And of course, Israel demands king. That's how we get King Saul. Saul, of course, is disobedient to God. His religion is more superstition. He's so focused on sacrificing and doing essentially rubbing his lucky rabbit's foot before he goes into battle without thinking about God's desire for obedience. And so his kingdom is removed from him. And is going to be given to someone else. That someone else is David. And then, of course, we have David and Goliath. We see David's rise. David's friendship with Jonathan, and then Saul's persecution of David. Finally, the story of 1 Samuel ends with the death of King Saul. So I've hopefully it's always hard to show maps on PowerPoint because no matter how big they are, especially Israel's hard because it's not wide, it's just tall. But I thought I would throw this up there because there's a few places that are mentioned in our text this morning as we begin 2 Samuel. But remember that, so Jerusalem is right here, and we usually think of Jerusalem as being the capital of Israel. But at this time, Jerusalem is not the capital of Israel. People are not reigning in, Saul is not reigning in Jerusalem. What's the name of the people who are currently living in Jerusalem at this time? Starts with a J, but it's not Jerusalemites. The Jebusites. Okay? So, and remember, all the way back, Jerusalem has been important all the way back because even Melchizedek in the book of Genesis, he's the king of Salem. And Salem is an old word for Jerusalem. You can kind of see it, Jerusalem, right? So, David is ultimately going to conquer Jerusalem. Remember, all these places are relatively small. Jerusalem at the time of David is estimated to be about 2 acres. These are not huge cities as we might think of them. Of course, here is where we have the Philistines and some of them eradicated. Then we have Mount Gilboa up here, which is where Saul and Jonathan are going to die, and there's going to be that great defeat of the people. So what is going to happen in the first couple of chapters of 2 Samuel, and you may remember this from our previous discussions about this, when we are used to peaceful transitions of power. Obviously we have a democratic republic, and we have and having, as you often hear, the peaceful transition of power in modern monarchies. When Queen Elizabeth died, no one was debating about who was going to be king. Now there were people saying, "Hey, King Charles is too old. He doesn't need to be king. It needs to skip. Whatever." But no one was. There is an alternate line of succession for the throne to England, and that's through it's called the Jacobites, and those were Catholic rulers, and of course you go back into the kind of Reformation, and just after that you have a lot of back and forth. But King James the Jacobites are named after King James. He was Catholic. So there's still some people out there that could kind of claim, hey, we have the throne. But the people in the Jacobite lineage were not saying, hey, we're going to go to war over who's going to be king. Charles is the next in line. But that is really a very modern concept. And even just within a few hundred years ago, there would be quite a bit of infighting anytime a king or a queen died. And this is certainly the case in ancient times. So we know that David has been anointed to be the next king for a long time, decades perhaps at this point. How many people know that David is supposed to be king? And most of them, but there's really not been a public declaration of that. Remember when Samuel goes and he anoints public display? Yeah, well, they're out in the countryside. And you remember when Samuel goes to do that, you remember how God sort of gives him a cover story? He says, take you some animals. If anybody asks, you're going to make a sacrifice. Because Samuel was afraid. He knows Saul's heart. He says, I can't go out here and anoint another king. And so it all is very hush-hush. And And, people recognize David as a leader, even back to just after the David and Goliath story. Saul has killed his thousands, but David has killed his 10,000s. And there was a lot of people who put a lot of faith and trust in David, and this is one of the reasons that Saul persecutes him so much. But there's not been sort of this, hey, everybody sit down, God has removed this the kingship from Saul, and now he's given it to David. And so, by what most people would know, and kind of the standard way of doing things, if Saul dies, who's supposed to be king? Jonathan. Jonathan died when Saul died. So now what? Well, there would be a line of succession, wouldn't there? But so here's where we're going to see there's this civil war that is going to erupt very quickly between people who are aligned with David and see David as the rightful king, and people who see the line of the descendants, surviving sons of Saul as being a potential or the rightful heir. So just kind of wanted to put our minds in that. So if we look in 2 Samuel chapter 1, beginning in verse 1, it says, Now, when it had come to pass after the death of Saul, that when David had returned from the slaughter, and when David was returned from the slaughter of the Amalekites, that David had abode 2 days in Ziklag. And it even came even to pass on the third day that, behold, a man came out of the camp from Saul with his clothes rent and earth upon his head. And so it was, when he had come to David, that he fell to the earth and did obedience. No, not obedience, did obeisance. So I guess, see, I'm not used to the King James, so I'm not used to that. And when David had said unto him, From whence have you come? He said to him, Out of the camp of Israel, where I escaped. And David said to him, How went the matter? I pray, tell me. And he answered, That the people are fled from the battle, and many of the people are also fallen and dead. Also Saul and Jonathan his son are dead. And David said to the young man that told him, How do you know that Saul and Jonathan his son are dead? And the young man said to him, As I happened by chance upon Mount Gilboa, behold, Saul leaned upon his spear, and lo, the chariots and the horsemen followed hard after him. And when he looked behind him, he saw me, and he said to me, he called to me, and I answered, Here I am. And he said to me, Who are you? And I answered, I'm an Amalekite. And he said to me again, Stand, I pray thee, upon me, and slay me, for anguish is come upon me, because my life is yet whole in me. And so I stood upon him and slew him. And because I was sure that he could not live after that, he was fallen. And I took the crown that was on his head and the bracelet that was on his arm, and I have brought them here unto you. So what happens? David has been off fighting the Amalekites. And so when David's done fighting the Amalekites, so he's going to return. And when he returns, he's at Ziklag. And when he's waiting at Ziklag, and this news comes to him from Mount Gilboa about Saul and Jonathan. Now, there's a lot of questions about this. We don't know how much has... did he know? Has he heard the word yet? For sure, we just don't know. But this Amalekite man comes to David, and he brings him news. So imagine this guy comes, and he's tattered and he's dirty, and he comes to David, and he says, I've come out of the camp of Israel. And this, so to kind of get a little bit ahead, this whole interaction is a little weird. There's a lot of confusion going on here. And the motives of this man are not quite clear. As he says he's come from the camp of the Israelites, which would be odd because what sort of nationality is this man? He's an Amalekite, okay? Do the Amalekites and the Jews get along? No. Where has David just come from, or who has David just come from fighting? The Amalekites. So we've got an enemy saying, I was in the camp, and now I'm coming to you to tell you what I saw. And the whole story, his story is not quite reliable. Now, if we were to look back in the last chapter of 1 Samuel, and we read about the death of Saul and Jonathan, how did Saul die? Do you remember? He fell on his own sword. Okay, he committed suicide, didn't he? What did he ask first? Do you remember? Yeah, he asked his armor bearer to kill him. And will the armor bearer do that? No. And so the armor bearer was like, no, I'm not going to do that. So Saul took his sword and he falls on it. And then verse 6 of 1 Samuel chapter, or rather, verse 5 of 1 Samuel chapter 31 says, when his armor bearer saw that Saul was dead, he fell likewise upon his sword and died with him. All right, so we've already got some discrepancies. These two things can't be the case. So on one hand, we've got the biblical account says he asked his armor bearer to kill him. Armor bearer won't do it. Saul falls on his sword. He kills himself. Then the armor bearer sees he's dead, so then he kills himself since he sees that Saul is dead. And that's the end. So this Amalekite already, again, we don't know if David has actually heard word yet or not. Maybe, probably not. But we already can see that there's some inconsistencies, some lies specifically. So the Amalekite man says, I just happened to be on Mount Gilboa. Have you ever happened to be on a mountain? I mean, no, it's not likely, is it? If you're on a mountain, you're probably there for a reason. You know, you didn't fall up the mountain, did you? Or stumble up it. So I just happened to be there. Well, why are you there? You're not party to either one of these fights that are going on. And he says, I happen to be there. And Saul's leaning on his spear. Another inconsistency, sword versus spear. Now, there are spears of various lengths. But, you know, if you imagine even a spear that's 6 feet long or so, you know, the logistics of that are kind of hard, isn't it? And so Saul has run himself through with a spear, according to the Amalekite, but he looks behind him and sees this random guy and says, hey, come over here and kill me. And the Amalekite man says, that's what I did. I killed him. And now I took his crown and I took his bracelet and I'm bringing it here to you. So obviously this story does not match because according to 1 Samuel, Saul is dead before his armor bearer kills himself. According to this man, Saul's run himself through with a spear and is by himself and still alive and asks this man to kill him. Presumably David doesn't know. He wasn't there. He doesn't know all the facts. It's going to become really important later. So why is this man coming to tell David? Well, there's a couple of options. One, he just wants David to know. But what is very likely is that this man thought that he was going to be praised by David. Because although everybody did not know that David was going to be king, everybody knew that Saul was trying to kill David. What is the very human reaction to the death of someone who is trying to kill you? Relief. Happiness, right? And so it's very possible that this Amalekite man, why is he there to begin with? Well, one of the things that you don't always think about this, But thinking about the aftermath of battles, we thinking like the Civil War. It's kind of the most local war that we can probably imagine, although it's quite a long time ago now. After the Civil War, and you have these, hundreds of thousands, and some of these battles are over 100,000 people fighting, and there's a lot of bodies. There's a lot of wounded. What happens? Well, they've got to be buried. Some cases they're buried and then they're dug up later and they're moved somewhere else and to a more permanent place. But there's also stuff to pick up. There's guns, there's provisions, all this stuff. People die, they don't need it anymore, but you got to gather it up because you don't want your enemy getting it or whatever. So this has kind of always been the case. And in the ancient world, you would have kind of these bands of people who would follow armies into the field, and after the battle, they would go in and try to steal stuff before the victorious army. They would usually withdraw and, tend to their wounded and those sorts of things. But then they're going to go back out and try to loot and things like that. So these people would try to come in before that. That's very likely what this Amalekite man was doing. And he just so happened to find Saul, and Saul still had his crown, and he still had this armband that was a sign of his kingship. And so this Amalekite, who, by the way, his people have just been being slaughtered by David, says, hey, this would be a good way to ingratiate myself to David. To me, that makes the most sense, especially when we consider that his story does not match what we know to be the case in Scripture, according to 1 Samuel. So that's going to be really important. So he thinks, though, that David is going to pat him on the back. Oh, I'm not going to kill you because you're so, you killed my enemy. But let's see if that's how that played out. Verse 11 said, then David took hold on his clothes, and he rent them, and likewise the men that were with him. And they mourned, and they wept, and they fasted until evening for Saul and Jonathan his son, and for the people of the Lord, and for the house of Israel, because they were fallen by the sword. So what is David's first reaction? Well, for a day, or until the evening, he and all of his people are in mourning. So they tear their clothes, and the language is a little confusing, but it's not saying he grabbed this Amalekite man and tore his clothes. David's tearing his own clothes, sign of grief and sorrow, and they are fasting, and they're doing all the traditional things that would be done when someone dies. Now, this is not something that this is a display that's not quite familiar to us, because we have, in our culture, we have a very subdued response to death usually. And if you don't, it's not a bad thing if you get very emotional. But if you go to most funerals, we may cry, we may shed some tears, but we kind of have this idea of being strong, and that's just our culture. And I'll never forget, there was a student when I was at Freed-Hardeman. There was a student from Africa, and it was in a class, and he made a comment. It was a class that involved the idea of death. It was a life cycle class, and this guy from Africa said, you people in America go to great lengths to pretend that your dead people aren't dead. He was like, you spend all this money, you put them far away from you, you bury them really quick, and you act like it doesn't upset you. And in his country, they literally buried their family members in the floor of the house. They had dirt floors, and so when someone died, you dug a hole and you put them in there. And they had, kind of a lot more traditional kind of wailing, grieving processes. And in the ancient world, that was very common. So this would have been a very overt display of grief that happens for the majority of a day. And so what is David doing? Early on, we're going to see David is making very clear to everyone, and this is not just a political play. Did David care for Jonathan? Absolutely. He loved him. Did David care for Saul? Yes. To the extent that David had several opportunities to kill Saul, but he wouldn't. Why wouldn't he do that? He's the anointed. God anointed him. God chose him. And even though God has chosen me, it's not my place to end him. Okay, so he is showing grief over this. And if at anything, it's kind of that idea of that we say in our country sometimes, you respect the office, not the person. You may not like the person, but you respect the position that they hold. And so he's showing a lot of grief over this, and he's making it clear to people, this is not something that we are going to celebrate. We are not going to revel in the suffering and the death, even of someone who was an enemy to me personally, because he was the king of the people. And so this sets up what causes a lot of people to kind of scratch their head in this first chapter of 2 Samuel. Verse 13 says that David said to the young man that told him, where are you? And he answered, or where are you from? And he said, I am the son of a stranger and an Amalekite. So the ESV says, I'm a sojourner. And David said to him, how was it that you are not afraid to stretch out your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? So potentially another lie. This idea of a sojourner. Now, the Amalekite is a foreigner, but he says, I'm a sojourner, and that would be language to use to describe someone who was, I don't know, in our modern language, we might say a resident alien. Someone who is not a citizen, but they are living in the land, right? And so he says, I'm a sojourner, but I've been living in your country. That's why he would use the term sojourner. I'm not from here, but I've been here. And so David then says, if that's the case, where do you get the idea of thinking that you can kill the Lord's anointed, the king that was anointed by God? See, if you were a sojourner in our land, if he would have known better than to do that. Imagine that you moved to another country. How long would you have to live there before you understood that it would be bad to kill the leader of that country? You would not even have to get off the plane to understand that, would you? No matter what kind of person that is, you would know that is not my role to do that. And so while this man had come to David with potentially the expectation of reward or the expectation of protection or whatever that may be, it quickly turns on him because David says, now who are you to have done that? And this is why I think that David doesn't know exactly what has happened, because he's believing this man's story. He's not angry at him because he's lying. He's angry at him for what he has said that he has done. And although that man thought that he was doing something good, in David's mind it was wicked. And so verse 15 said, David called one of the young men and said to him, go near and fall upon him. And he did, and he fell on him, and he killed him, and he died. And David said unto him, your blood is upon your head, for your mouth has testified against you, saying, I have slain the Lord's anointed. And David lamented with this lamentation over Saul and over Jonathan his son. So we're going to stop there, because there's this psalm, the Psalm of the Bow as it's called, as David is going to reflect on that. But in killing this man, this causes a lot of people some concern when they read this. So this man just comes and tells David what happened, and then David says, well, I'm going to kill you. And Saul asked him to kill him. But again, it doesn't match the previous account from 1 Samuel. And really the reason that David responds like this is that David just goes on for what this man has told him, and he says, you've testified against yourself that you've killed the king. But the bigger message is, this was not okay. And it is what is the purpose of capital punishment? It's death. But why? Why do we kill people? In some ways that's easier, isn't it? I don't know. If you gave me the option, life in prison or death, I'd probably say life in prison. But in many ways, death is easier. It ends suffering and those sorts of things. But the point of the death penalty is not just to punish that person, but it is to send a message, isn't it? Why is the death penalty reserved for the most heinous of crimes? Because it needs to be a message to the public that if you do this, this is going to be the consequence. And so as David is facing this transition, it's going to be quite tumultuous, this transition of power. He is wanting everyone to know, if you think that you are going to gain favor with me by retaliating against Saul's family, then you've got another thing coming. And this is going to be some steps, really, that we're going to see to David, steps of reconciliation that he's going to try to make throughout the several years that it's going to take to consolidate power. A civil war is going to break out, but that's not what David wants. David wants his people to be unified, but they have to be unified for the right reasons. And ultimately, they have to be unified in their service to the Lord. So we'll go ahead and stop there, and we will pick up there next week.